Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. And I'm delighted to have someone I've known and respected for a long time, Pavita Cooper. Pavita is a board advisor. She's chair of the 30% Club, which is a very important organization we'll hear more about later. And she's a non-executive director to a number of very interesting organizations, such as the newly named the King's Trust, formerly the Prince's Trust, the Old Vic, back in the theatre land. And then she does some really exciting work with organizations within government that we can't even talk about, but it's so interesting. So without further ado, Pavita, welcome to the Inspiring Leadership podcast.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning.
Yeah, well, it's just great. And of course, going back a long way, we've had your husband on,
Yes.
Steve Cooper, and Aldermore Bank CEO. And yeah, it's just been nice to follow the career of the two of you for some years. And even my daughter Bryony worked with Steve, your husband, and in his team was a nice young man called Mark, who Bryony is now married to, and she's just had her first baby. So you'll have to tell
Fantastic.
your husband that she's got a 5-week-old baby, and she's just
Brilliant.
maternity leave, having been the chief of staff to the head of Ocado, the sort of retail merger, the joint venture, who's a female CEO, which is very good, which we'll
Yes.
talk
Yeah.
about later on. Anyway, without further ado, tell me about your own business. I mean, you're doing so many different things and the work you do to help leaders and teams.
I do a range of very different things. So I split my time predominantly in three ways. I have a portfolio non-executive career, and then I spend time in organizations advising chairs and boards and CEOs and executive teams around culture, inclusion, and leadership. And then I spend, it's supposed to be a third of my time, but it's basically every other hour that I have campaigning for greater equity across business and society.
Yeah, well, it's really important. And I think I'm seeing a bit, we're seeing this with Kemi Badenoch and other people that they're going, oh, we've, spending too much time on these woke things and, too much time on diversity and equality. Let's go back to how it was. And I really hope we don't, because it really is the dark ages. But that's a whole conversation in its own right. But what is your response to these people who are rather rubbishing that we've spent too much time on diversity, equality, and inclusion, and it's time to get back to how things were before?
Well, I think what that really detracts from is the fact that this is not an initiative around DNI. This is a business issue. And I talk about businesses who want to win. So if you're a really ambitious CEO and you want to win in your sector, you want your business to be best in class and you want to beat the competition, surely you want to be participating in all of the talent pool that's available to you and have the very best capability and have a workforce and a leadership team that reflects the customers and consumers that you serve, and people who have an understanding about the products that you're trying to build and develop. And nowhere in that does that talk about needing quotas or tokenism. It's just about having the very best people in order to win.
Yeah, that really makes complete practical common sense. It makes sense. It's not just a good idea and the right thing to do. If you're purely focused on performance metrics, you will perform better. And I've seen that myself. Um, Talking of which, do you want to just briefly explain what the 30% Club is? And then we'll go on to talk about some of the inspiring CEOs and people in sort of top positions that you want to give a call out to and the sort of qualities that you've seen in them. But firstly, tell us about the 30% Club.
So the 30% Club was the first campaign ever around gender equality set up in the UK in 2010. And in fact, next year we're celebrating our 15th year. And the genesis of 30% Club was a moment in time when Helena Morrissey, the founder, with Baroness Mary Gowdy, came together and said, look, we are spending a lot of time talking about the need for greater representation on boards in the UK, but we're doing this in an echo chamber. It's women talking to women. And unless we bring in the people with the power who can really influence the change, nothing's going to be different. And so, what was really clever about this campaign, it was a campaign about men and women working together to drive change. And it really focused on being in a business led campaign. Now, over the last 14 years, the UK has made phenomenal progress, but we've done that all through a voluntary approach in this country, which I think is what makes it so outstanding. We haven't set quotas. There's been targets set by government around giving direction to businesses, but there's never been any legal quotas imposed. And in those early days, there was only about 12% representation of women in boards in the UK, and all the chairs were men. And so it was those early adopting men that came to the table and said, we're going to help you make this change. And people like, Rob Swannell and the late Wyn Bishop, who was my chair at Lloyds Banking Group, phenomenal men that really understood it was their job to create the change. And they remain our members. So the members are the CEOs and the chairs, who historically were all men, and obviously now there's more balance. And that's what was different about our campaign. And now today in the UK, we have over 45% representation on boards across the FTSE 350, and one of the most advanced and progressive in the world. And again, we've done that through a voluntary approach. The campaign has extended in multiple ways. We have multiple chapters around the world now. We have expanded our goals to include race as well, to in line with the Parker Review. So we're all about ensuring that boards are fully representative, and we now also look at representation, executive level and leadership, which is Exco -1 also. And we continue to work with our members to say, how do we continue to extend these goals?
I'm really excited about that. I think it's so important, the work that has been done by a whole variety of people. And as you say, often it's the people who are in the privileged position that have to call out that the status quo isn't acceptable. It has to change, and not waiting for somebody else, like that Obama quote, we are the ones. We can't wait for some other person and some other time. It's got to be us. And the other one about, how can a small group of determined men and women achieve things? Well, all the change in the world has ever been achieved by small groups of determined men and women.
And we're volunteers, by the way. So, the only full-time staff we have are 1.5 people at the centre to support our global campaign. So this is all done through voluntary endeavour.
And that is even more important. And I think of Lee, my wife, who's CEO of the Inspiring Leadership Foundation for vulnerable women and young people now. We expanded it. But she's a volunteer. She gives all her time as CEO for free. And I think that's when you've got a cause, like you're part of a cause, it really excites you to do good. And actually, by doing good, there's a spin-off that you get to meet some really interesting people. And if you've got your own business as well, there is a benefit that comes from that. But you're not doing it for that first. That becomes the spin-off by doing the right thing, not things right, but doing the right thing. Let's have a talk about the people that you'd want to sing out about, that you have found them to be what you'd define as inspiring leaders. Interesting to hear what you think is your definition of an inspiring leader. Obviously, the podcast is about this, and one or two qualities of different people. So over to you.
So I had the privilege of working with some phenomenal leaders. I've had a very long career. So in that time, you get to meet with lots of people. And now I go into lots of organizations, so I see lots of great leaders. But I'm going to very intentionally focus specifically on women today. But I wanted to point out that doesn't mean I haven't worked with the most phenomenal men, because I have. And I may just call out one or two of them at the end. But very early in my career, there were some women that I think had a very profound impact on me, and some of whom will be known to people who are listening to the podcast, particularly the most recent ones, but some of the early ones they won't. When I first started working, I was a management trainee with the Burton Group, and my very, very first boss was a lady called Diana Randall, who I recently reconnected with. And bearing in mind, I was very young. I was probably sort of 19, I think, at the time. And she was the most impressive woman I had ever met. So nobody like her existed in my circle growing up. Nobody in my family looked like her. She was exceptionally glamorous, and I always loved that. I love fashion, I love makeup, and I looked at her and thought, I just want to be her. But she was really smart. She had a fierce intellect, and she just had this amazing presence and impact. And I looked at her and I watched her and the reaction other people had, including senior men around her. And there was something about the way people responded to her, and the way, even when she didn't speak, the presence she had. And I recently reached out to her to tell her. And in fact, it was on the back of another podcast I'd done where someone had asked me to think about those early experiences. And I credit her with so much of what I tried to model myself on and what I wanted to be. And that was really important, because there are even times now where I think, Gosh, I learned that from Diana when I was 19 years old. I learned how to be, and I sat in interviews with her and watched her talk to people in interviews. I watched her negotiate with buyers. And she was really, although she was glamorous, she would then just slice through the conversation with a really tough question or really push someone. But she just did it in this elegant way where I thought, you can still be this amazing woman, but you can still be very, very competent, capable, and admired by others. And I was speaking at an event recently, and Stuart Rose was there, who was the CEO at the time of the Burton Group, and he didn't remember me, but I told him how I used to be terrified when he walked around the stores, and he talked about her. And I just think that's amazing that in that early in your career, someone can have such a profound impact.
Well, we're staying with what you've just done there. It's so lovely that you wrote to her. And this is something that time and again in my career, I've been prompted to write to people. I had a commanding officer, John Griffin, who was in the SAS, but a great inspiration to me. He came to my 60th birthday party. I got him and his wife Marion back. But just ringing them or writing to people who made such a profound impact on your life, like Richard Dannett, who was my commanding officer and just such a great influence on me. And they, you think, well, they're so famous and they're so, everybody knows how wonderful they are. They must know. But actually, they're very touched when you genuinely reach out and you say, look, just want to say you had such a positive impact on my life in these ways. And I just want to say thank you. It's before you die, really. It's these kind of things you ought to, well, before they do. I mean, I managed to have a lovely conversation with General Sir Mike Jackson, who sadly died this week, aged 80. But he and I were in correspondence just mere 3 months ago. What a, gravelly, tough, hard
Yeah.
leader, but cared about the people he led. And I think having those kind of conversations, very profound. Have you done it with others that you've dropped them notes as well?
Yeah, so the other person I would talk about is actually, unfortunately, another late great leader, Pat O'Driscoll, who
Oh,
was
yes, I knew Pat. I coached her.
my boss's boss when I first joined Shell. And one of the reasons that I met her is that I was going to be working in a team that was all male. And I sort of said to them, look, I need to meet another senior woman, otherwise I'm nervous about joining this business. And Pat was rolled out, and again, formidable. But we formed an amazing bond, even though she was my boss's boss, and became really good friends. And she then left and went on to a number of different things, including CEO of Northern Foods. And unfortunately, 10 years ago, became very ill and passed away. But we had a wonderful holiday where we went to the Chiba Som in Thailand with two other girlfriends. And so we had some amazing experiences before she passed, because the illness came on very quickly. It was very sudden, but I miss her to today because she was someone who, if you needed great sage advice, if you needed someone to give you some straight talking, she was the woman. And again, in a team where it was all men, and I was very young, I think I was not even 30. She was such a huge sponsor and motivator, and someone who really pushed me forward and helped me believe I could do pretty much whatever I wanted to do. And I think another amazing role model to so many men and women.
Yeah, well, it's what a small world. I was very lucky to be Pat's coach when she was the CEO of Northern Foods. And it was a real honor working with her. And indeed, I got her, we had a long discussion to come out about her sexual orientation, which at that time wasn't a thing people did. But she spoke about it. Well, yeah, we're fine. We all knew anyway. So we're really comfortable about it. And that really had such a profound impact. The honesty, the openness, the trust that she built around her. She was a straight talking person. But I do think that the very aggressive and toxic takeover of Northern Foods by another organization caused such prolonged stress and strain on her. The doctors at the time wondered whether the cancer, which eventually killed her, was triggered by all that horrendous experience. And I think that's a lesson which you as an advisor will have come across for our CEOs to look after and chairmen to look after their own health and well-being. And when they're in a very toxic environment, that's now 3 CEOs that I've worked with who the environment they were in really affected their health and led, who knows, but there was a trigger and a connection with cancer, which the doctors pronounced, not just me thinking idly in the bath, but just whether it be brain tumors or other cancers, when you're in a constant high stress, high cortisol, high adrenaline environment, it's really not good for your health. I don't know whether you've come across that kind of situation.
Very much so. I mean, I think the other thing is people talk about it a lot more. I think it's okay for people to talk about their health, and many of the professional services firms really encourage their partners to go on retreats, take time off. Like vitality is considered to be an important part. But when you and I are of a similar age, when we were coming through, it was a badge of honor to sort of work yourself into the ground, and um, resilience wasn't really something people talked about. I mean, I think I work with so many CEOs now that will very proudly say, "I'm going off for a run. I need to go and exercise. I'm taking some time to go and do what I need to do." And actually, that is seen as a positive. It's seen as a signal that health and vitality matters. Because if you're in for the long game, you really need to. And I just found out 2 weeks ago that a previous colleague at Barclays has just passed away. And we're at the age now where he was quite a bit older than me, probably in his mid 60s. But even so, it was just so painful, because you think we're getting to that point now where we're hearing about colleagues that we've worked with, and it's been very, very tough. So I think it's important. I've got two more women, just very quickly, if I can.
Please. Yeah, no, no.
One at a different stage of her career, sort of someone who's had a massively enjoying career, and one who's sort of more at the early stages. So the one who's sort of further ahead than me is Baroness Mary Gowdy. She's 79. She's in the House of Lords, and she continues to be a phenomenal inspiration to me. And I sort of think she, to me, is someone where I think that's what I would like to be doing at that stage in my life, still being relevant, making a difference. So, as I already mentioned, Mary is with Helena Morrissey, founded the 30% Club. But Mary has had a career that has really been shaped by her commitment to improving gender equality in the world. She works in Washington to promote peace, but she does a lot of work to support violence against women and young girls. And I just look at her energy and her tenacity, and she's absolutely fabulous. And I look at her and think, she's fabulous. She's a role model. She's a great supporter. She's a mentor. But I think that's what I want to be doing. When people say to me, "When are you going to be stopping working?" I'm like, I'm not. This is who I am. This is not about work. This is about this is how I am in the world, and this is who I am and what I do. And earlier in their career, I mean, as you already mentioned, I work across national security. There is a phenomenal young woman called Felicity Oswald, who up until a couple of weeks ago was the interim CEO at the National Cybersecurity Centre. And she stepped up to cover while there was an external hiring process for a CEO going on. And she has done a phenomenal job. And during that period, she was the face of Cyber UK, and she has done a great job about promoting women and gender in this space in a world that is full of men talking about cyber and AI risk. And I think it's been wonderful to see her be front and center of that. And she's got a wonderful career ahead of her. And it's really exciting to see women like her come through.
It's very exciting, and I think there's often, it makes me realize, in many of the engineering, technology, IT sectors, it's just a blokes club, and they so need women in that sector. Now, sometimes they get women, and the question of masculine and feminine brains, but some sort of sharp-elbowed women who are even more masculine than some of the men sometimes. But having female leaders who've got high IQ and high EQ, that's an absolute joy. It's a winner every time. Or even if you have in that world of CTOs, CIOs, someone who has EQ as well as IQ, wow, you're off the races. You go, my God, they do care. There's someone I'm thinking of recently in the sort of world of technology, and a lot of dramas around them because they're not picking up how the more junior members of staff think, or how colleagues in other departments are left feeling after the interaction with them. What was that old saying? People forget what you say, they forget what you do, but they never forget how you make them feel.
Maya Angelou, yeah.
Yeah, that's so important. Great. So let's I'm always interested in people's origin story. Obviously yours, Pavita, I think will be very interesting. Just spend, if you would, sort of 5 minutes giving us a flavor of upbringing, primary caregivers who shaped you and the values that you're carrying today from them. Might be some people you decided not to be like them because you thought, no, I'm going to do the opposite to that. Sometimes we are the mirror, or we decide to do the reverse. that has shaped you into the leader you are today?
So my parents were immigrants into this country, economic migrants in the late 60s. And although they came from India, they'd actually both been born in different parts of the world. So my mum was actually born in Nairobi in Kenya, and my dad was born in Burma in Rangoon. And both of them had to leave because war had broken out in both countries. And then they came back and settled in India. So for both of them, that was a transition that was very difficult. And people often forget that for many of the Indian diaspora, they didn't start their life in India, they started in other places. My grandfather had a watch company that now he then started again in Ambala in Punjab that still exists and is run by another family, but has our family name Grewal above the door. And we went back last April with my boys and we took them there. And it was a very emotional moment because we went to the house that my grandmother lived in, that I used to go to as a child. And it just felt like a spiritual returning home. It was very important. But they came here in the late 60s. My mum had been a teacher in India, but at the time the British government didn't recognise any qualifications. So she had to go back to university and retrain. And my dad, like so many other professional men, ended up working in the Mount Pleasant sorting office, which is where all the doctors, engineers, accountants worked. And it was tough because these were really highly educated men and they had two choices. They either ended up in Southall where there was a rubber factory, or they ended up in Mount Pleasant Post Sorting Office, which is where they made many of their families weren't here. So these early relationships they built formed a really important part of the fabric of their life because they also needed to support each other because there was no childcare, there was nobody else. So they relied on these people who were friends who became family. And those people are still in our lives today. And so I think that experience of having no money, no opportunity, of course, it shaped my parents and therefore it really shaped me. So the sorts of things I learned about are how supporting a wider system is really important. And my mum was brilliant at that. So she helped everybody. So often on a Saturday morning, people who were struggling with immigration claims, my mum would be filling out forms. It was like a small clinic at our house. And so what I noticed them both doing is helping other people, not because they were going to get anything out of it, because they had this sense of we all have to help each other. And the other really profound thing that happened to my parents is they were renting when I was born. They had so little money when I was born, they put me in a drawer. And my friends still laugh about that because I still go on about it. But there was an amazing couple that lived on their road, Mr. and Mrs. Entwistle, and they lent my parents the money to buy their first home so that they wouldn't have to be in this shared rented home with me. And I think in today's world, there is so much talk about discourse and about communities not supporting each other. I think people forget that when those early Windrush and Indian immigrants came over, there were many very, very good people. And that amazing man, woman who helped my parents really shaped the start of our lives because without it, they'd have still been living in a rented house with 5 or 6 other families. And they were absolutely amazing. And they were like parents to my mum and dad at a time when they desperately missed their own parents, desperately missed their own families. And they were amazing. They supported me like grandparents. And my mum still talks about that in a way where it's very visceral. You know, the emotion is just below the surface because she recognizes the role that they played in her life. So although it was difficult, we didn't have a car till I was about 9 or 10. We walked everywhere. We didn't have a TV. There were many things we didn't have. What we had was a really strong sense of family, identity, lots of love, a lot of focus on education as a way out to do well, and a lot of confidence that you can be whatever. We've come here so you can be whatever you can be, but never doubting the support and security we had from a wider family.
It's really interesting. What a special upbringing, which was so hard, but with the Entwistle's kindness. You remind me, Lee and I just came back from a lovely 2 week holiday in Morocco, and we were taken by a Berber guide, a lady, to up into her villages in the mountains. And the Berbers are the indigenous people in Morocco. They were there way before the Arabs were ever there. And they've had a pretty hard life. And of course, 3,000 Berbers died in the earthquake last year. And so we passed through, not deliberately, but just it happened to be in the area, very close to the epicenter of the earthquake. And still many of the buildings had gone down. But your story really reminded me of the experience we had. There were people who had so little. They were in a plastic tent put up by the Moroccan government. and they'd lost their homes, but they came out and they gave us walnuts and they gave us apples. They weren't wanting anything back. This was just what they did. And when you have so little, I think often humans are kinder and nicer than when we get lots of the trappings of capitalism and, two or three different watches and all these things that we don't need all those extra stuff, but we have them. And the same story when I lived in Cyprus, when I was doing the mountain marathon and running up in the mountains, I'd come across a remote village miles from anywhere. A little old man would come out and offer me a glass of ouzo and some grapes. I mean, he had so little in his life, but he was giving it to me as a visitor to his area. And I think you're tapping into something that we often lose at our own cost. That this kindness and this thoughtfulness about the community, about helping others. And look what a difference it's made. The Entwistles helped your parents, which helped you, and you've touched the lives of thousands of people, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Were they to know the girl in the drawer would do the things you've done, hey?
They were absolutely amazing. But yes, I mean, I've worked a lot in places like South Africa and townships. When I was working out there, I'd volunteer at the weekends, and the same thing. You'd go into a township where people had nothing, but they'd welcome you into their home, and they would make beautiful tables out of cardboard, put doilies on top, and just give you whatever they had. And it's the same in India when you go into some of the really difficult parts of, into the slums where people will do the same thing. They'll come and they'll give you whatever they have. But I think it's part of our culture as well. So we're the same now, that if anyone in the family needs support, we're all there. It's part of how we've been brought up. It's part of our identity. But I think my parents definitely instilled that in me very early, which is the moment you can, you should be doing everything you can to help other people.
Yeah, I think that's really special. Well, look, take us on from the young leader at school and things. How do you come to be doing the things you've been doing now? Just give us a whistle-stop tour through some of the different jobs and experiences you've had and how you grew and who helped you on the way.
I think the main thing I would say is, like many people, I didn't have a plan. If I think about where I am now, which sometimes I have to sort of pinch myself when I'm doing something amazing, I'm like, how did this happen? There was no plan. It evolved and it emerged. I think the only thing that's been enduring is that I realized early on that one of the things I had, which was a superpower, which I now realize was to mask some of the things I couldn't do, is I was really good at relationships and really good at connecting with other people and engaging on a really human level. So in retail, you have to work with very senior bosses, people like Stuart Rose at the time, but your customers and also colleagues on the shop floor. It's a real range, and you're dealing with people. Customers come from all walks of life, and when you can deal with difficult customers when you're very young, you can deal with anything. So going in and meeting some, really scary chair never worried me, because I dealt with all these difficult customers. So from a young age, I was very comfortable at moving up and down, from the executive floor all the way to the shop floor. And I realize now that that's something that those early experiences gave me, which meant that when I then progressed quickly, and I did progress very quickly, I was very young by the time I was at executive level, it was those early experiences. And when I talk about masking, it's because I have one of our children is very neurodiverse, and he has many brilliant skills and attributes. But having spent lots of time with him, being assessed, I realized when they ask you the questions, how does this show up? Does this person do that? I'm like, gosh, that was me. That is me. And of course, what I realized is because I was going to school in the 70s and 80s, this was completely undiagnosed. And I think there
What
was a
was what was the aspect of neurodiversity? Because I'm dyslexic and have dyscalculia.
I'm not in any way self-diagnosing. I don't want someone listening to this thing. She shouldn't be self-diagnosing. But there are elements of dyslexia and dyspraxia and probably even dyscalculia that I think I had.
Yeah.
And what I did is I overcame it by making my strengths such spikes to compensate, which is what many, many people do. And so I think that's what happened. It became the superpower. I overcompensated because I couldn't name it. I couldn't make sense of it. Like, I was rubbish at sport. I couldn't catch the ball in netball.
Yeah, yeah, I relate that.
It makes sense now, because I couldn't because of the lack of coordination.
Yep.
And so many things, like even now, I love to cook. I love particularly Indian food, but I can't bake. And the reason I can't bake is because I can't follow a recipe. Because if I read it and then move away, before I know it, I've cracked all the eggs in and I go back and it says separate the eggs and I've missed that.
Yeah.
I can't follow a recipe. So I put my
You're making the hairs on my arms tingle because the reason why is I'm having a couple of people talking a lot about dyslexia, and a lot of the leaders that I have who have what I call the three hums that you have: humanity, humility, and a bit of humor, able to laugh at ourselves. Um, is that I remember my mother saying to me when I said, look, my teachers just told me I'm going to become a dustman because I'm thick, because I can't spell and I can't do my maths. And she said, don't worry, darling, you'll be good with people. Now, she essentially it was advised me to do what you've done, relationships and connecting. And isn't it a surprise that in our own different ways, we're both in the helping profession, working with boards and top teams, chairs and CEOs, because we love helping people and connecting with people and finding their origin story and what makes them tick and how to get people who dislike each other finding a way to work together. And I think it is that superpower that you find a way of overcoming, and you get a different muscle that develops because this one's atrophying. Yeah.
I think also the thing I've realized is I think, why is it that chairs and CEOs trust me? And I think it's because they feel safe, because I have so much empathy. I'm coming from a position of high support, not criticism, but I do tell the truth. So I will be brutally direct with people, but in a way which is about the winning part I said at the beginning, which is, if you want to win, if you want this organization to win, if you want the business to win, we have to address this specific issue, whether it's a blind spot in the organization or something that you're not addressing, whether it's about the culture, whether it's about particular leadership attribute. And I think it's because if people trust you, they are willing to have a conversation with you as opposed to feeling judged. And I think that's something I learned early on. And so the other thing that meant is that I got spotted very, very quickly, and I was being headhunted from different organizations to the next one, to the next one. And so again, it wasn't me purposefully choosing a path. It was people spotting me and saying, come and do the next big thing, come and do the big thing. And so I just found myself going into bigger and bigger jobs, leading bigger and bigger teams, working on a bigger global platform. And it was very exciting, but it was very unintentional. There was nothing sort of that I set out early to say that's what I want to do.
Yeah, and just very quickly for listeners around the world, there's probably about 125 different countries, people listening to you right now. What were the kind of organizations and roles that you did? Give us a few of the organizations and the roles.
I think I explained that early on in my career, I started on a management training program with the Burton Group, and that involved doing lots of different things. You start in stores, which I can wholly recommend. It's a brilliant experience because you see all of life there. And then I moved into head office and I did some sort of more policy type roles, writing policies for all the various organizations. But then I was doing buyer recruitment, and I'd always wanted to be a buyer, love fashion. So that was really exciting, meeting the people that were going to buy the clothes in Topshop, for example, and deciding who was going to do that. I then moved into an airport environment, British Airport Authorities, doing a regional HR job, and then moved to Shell. I've worked with Shell, Barclays globally for different CEOs, Lloyds Banking Group. And my work has always been around large scale organizational change, transformation, leadership, values, culture, and pretty much helping the CEO sort of set out what is it we're trying to achieve around here and what do we need from people capability in order to do that.
Wow. Well, what a collection of experiences, and beautifully sets you up to do the work you're doing now. You've had huge amounts of success, but we often learn the most from some of the darkest moments of our lives. I'm sure, like me, you've had many of those, but is there one in particular that you'd pick out as a dark moment of your life, and what it's taught you that you've applied since then? Because there's been some good lessons from it.
Yes, I mean, I think it was a moment in my life where I was at a crossroads. So, was it dark? I think it was probably professionally the most challenging moment I had. But I think compared to some of the hardships that people go through in their personal life, I wouldn't necessarily say it's dark from that perspective. But for me, it's been one of the most profound crossroads in my life that has been very significant. And that was when having had this really amazing career that had gone very quickly, completely, in an upward trajectory. At the point at which I started my family. So I was single for a very long time, and I met my husband much later in life, and I wasn't even sure I'd be having a family. I'd kind of come to the conclusion that I loved my job so much, I loved work so much, it very much defined me. But I was lucky enough to find out I was expecting my first child at 39 and my second at 43, 44. So there was this shift that suddenly, having been someone that had all this available time and capacity just to focus on work, I was going to have a young family. And so I found with one child, I could just about cope and hold it all together. We had the most phenomenal nanny, who, by the way, still works and supports our family with us. 17, 18 years later, she's still here, because we couldn't make it work without her. And then by the time I had my second child, when I found out I was expecting, that wasn't without challenges because of my age. So I had a couple of miscarriages. So that was very difficult. But facing into having a second very, very young child, I had to really think about how I was going to make it work. And I was in a senior position, which was, quite full on. It's all encompassing. I had a husband who was a CEO. And we were at that point on Sunday night with our Blackberries, because we had Blackberries in those days, of arguing who was going to be able to leave first. And I said, well, I've got a flight to Edinburgh, I've got to leave first. And he said, well, I'm going to so I've got to leave first. And we were already at that point where things were starting to get really tricky. And I ended up having to go on maternity leave slightly earlier because my health was at risk, because they called me a geriatric mum at that point. And I was in hospital, wired up to this machine, and they just said, we're just going to keep monitoring you. And I had a lot of time. I was just lying there and I was thinking, how is this actually going to work? So when this next baby comes along, how am I going to manage this young baby plus a child who's about to start nursery in prep school? How is that going to work? And how am I going to keep doing this and that? And I hadn't really thought about it, because I think I just pushed it to the back of my mind. And when I'd left my office, I put my shoes under my desk, said to my secretary, don't touch anything, I'll be back really quickly, because I just assumed I would. And I had this really challenging, dawning realization that something would have to shift. And at that stage, I realized that probably working at the level I was and the pace I wasn't going to be sustainable. But what I discovered when I tried to engage what that might look like differently, not just with my organization, but with other organizations at that moment in time, there was no alternative. I was basically being given messages that said, well, at this level, that's what it takes. You can't, there's no job you could do at this level working part-time. And I wasn't necessarily looking to work part-time. I was looking to say, I can't work the way I've been working. And it was really difficult. So I went through a bit of a crisis where I had to think about, well, what do I want to do? Do I want to sort of have two nannies, not be around for this amazing family that I never thought I'd have? Do I want to work in a way that allows me to still be engaged in the world and do the things I want to do, and but be the glue in my family, in my children's life, like be available emotionally for them and be involved in their life? And it was a really, really difficult thing. I felt very resentful that I felt as a woman I was being forced to make that choice. And bearing in mind, I have probably the most supportive husband, who is phenomenally supportive, encouraging, and has, I think, been the reason why I have been so successful, particularly in the second phase of my life, because of his support and encouragement. So it wasn't that I wasn't being supported. It was just I was faced with this harsh reality. And it was very, very difficult. And I felt very angry at the system, at the world. And that was the point at which I thought, whatever I do next, I want to do something about changing this. I feel so indignant that this is what the world is telling me. And I decided then to step away from my executive career. And I was probably quite young at that point to do that, but I had no idea what I was going to do. But I believed in myself. I knew I had an amazing network, and I just knew it would be okay. And the very next week, a very, very dear friend of mine, Dame Professor Heather McGregor, introduced me to Helena Morrissey, who said, I'm setting up something called the 30% Club. I'd love you to come and help us do that. And so the universe sort of opened up to me in a different way. And at that stage, I thought, if I was in this big job, I wouldn't have capacity to support a campaign like this. There's a reason why this has come now. And then I shaped my life and world around that. And it's been sort of 12 years since that happened. And so where I am today has evolved. I had no idea. I had to trust that it would just happen, and it did.
I think it's a fascinating story, and I relate to it strongly because in many ways, Lee, with doing her charity work and her facilitation and coaching and her podcasting, done a similar kind of thing to you. But I mean, at this stage, we've now got 3 grandchildren and a fourth on the way and 4 children all married.
I'm still worrying about Latin homework and where the rugby boots are. So
yeah. Uh, and I think having something which is a vocation, a calling, a dharma, if we to go back to the diaspora and the Indian roots, and it is just as an aside, there's so many of the leaders that I'm coaching who are from the Indian diaspora. Like, how come one country? I know what is the population of India now?
a billion.
Billion. But
Half of them
yet,
are
there's a disproportionate number of CEOs, CTOs, particularly with many of my American clients who are from, and in Germany, from the Indian diaspora. And I think one of the Indian presidents once joked that if he called all the diaspora home, the world would stop working. Many of the businesses, wouldn't be able to carry on.
It's that great little Hamlet, isn't it? Immigrants, they get the job done.
Yeah. Well, and there is phenomenal drive. At the same time, with those CEOs, there is this phenomenal drive a lot of the time to do it themselves because others won't get it done like they do because they're so driven and such a work ethic, and wanting to make the world a better place, that it's quite hard for them to empower and elevate and delegate. But they do it, but it's just they can't stop themselves, love to solve the problems and go back in, roll up their sleeves and get stuck in. But I think you've raised some fascinating things. One of them is I recently, as part of my own journey, did three things. One, I went to Peru and did plant-based medicine retreat with ayahuasca and San Pedro and various things. I went to some various religious sites. Machu Picchu, of course, was phenomenal. Second one, I then did the Vipassana 11-day silent Buddhist retreat with an Indian guru who led the group, and that was a good challenge. The third one, I did the Hoffman Institute, and then I did the Mankind Project, which is in a world of toxic masculinity. How do we get men to be a bit more in touch with who they are and better people in society rather than the bullying and the mistreatment of women and toxic masculinity.
Reducing depression and mental health. I mean, the
Correct.
terrible loss yesterday of Liam Payne.
Oh yeah.
Such a wonderfully talented, gifted young man. It's so tragic. You think had he had someone he felt we could go and talk to, maybe we wouldn't be here now. And I think there's so much suppressed for men not being able to surface feelings, doubts, and there's particularly older men in their 50s, the pressure of financial pressures, pressure to just keep going, work pressures. And I think there isn't enough space for men to be able to talk about some of those things.
I think it's really interesting. And there's the TV personality, Jason Fox, who is on the SS Who Dares Wins. Jason and I are preparing for him to come on the podcast. But I've just been listening to his book, Embrace the Chaos. And he talked about his own PTSD when his mental health was affected and he had to lead the Special Boat Squadron, the SBS. So many of the servicemen that I've talked to, either they or people they've known, particularly if they've done very challenging roles, which involves death and destruction and mayhem, it's really got to them. But the thing I was thinking about with all those different experiences that I had recently in my own development was the Hoffman process looks back at the age up to 13 for your children. And you just mentioned that your children are coming up to that age now. That you as parents, you and Steve, will have a huge positive or negative impact on them. And it is such a challenge. Your instinct is to be around and help them grow up. But yet, if you want to have a successful careers and pay for the quality of life you want, you're often out and about. Just thinking about your experience of absent parents, because many of the people who are on the course with me, 23 other people from around the world, a lot of them, I mean, there's a group of about 3, we celebrated their birthday and we sang happy birthday to them. Their parents had never celebrated their birthday with them. Now they were in their 40s now. And it's just like there were tears flowing down their face. And sometimes, and one of them, was told, I wish you didn't exist. I wish we'd never had you. I mean, what were they thinking of saying that to another human. And so I think there's, you are clearly, and I know Steve as well, as a very good parents and want to spend your time doing that. But you must come across lots of people who are very driven by their careers, that they are the absent parents and the latchkey children who look after themselves because the parents aren't around as they're growing up. What's your thoughts?
I've got two experiences. I mean, I think a lot of the older white upper class, middle class men I've worked with, in many instances, the Oxbridge educated ones were sent away to boarding school very, very young. And I think with some of those men, the British men particularly, it's less the case in Asia or obviously in America, that had a very profound impact on their early life experiences. And so the desire to sort of succeed or prove parents wrong, um, there's there's definitely a pattern in people who've had that life experience. And then I would say the other experience I have is of colleagues who I've got to know over the last 20, 30 years who also have come from a wider African or Indian diaspora, particularly the ones who came from Uganda, or various other war-torn countries where people were being ousted. Their experience was their parents came as economic migrants. They maybe worked in factories, so they had the key put around their neck, which is when I was at school. My mum was a teacher, and I went to a state school in Ealing where the kids would bust in from Southall, and those kids all came to school with keys around their neck because their parents were working in factories. Many of those kids didn't speak English, learned to speak English, went on to Oxford, super bright, because that drive is still there. Um, and so I think it can create two different experiences. My family experience is very different because what I have is many, many, many mums and dads. So we have all your aunties and uncles are your mums and dads, your cousins are your brothers and sisters. So early in life, you don't need friends. You have this amazing inbuilt wide family system that just protects you. And it can feel smothering sometimes. And poor Steve has had to learn to cope with my huge family. They adore him and he loves them. But it takes time to adjust. And so the upside is you never feel any deficit of love and support. It's fantastic. I know I can call, and they don't care who you are or what you do. They just love you for who you are. But it can feel very overwhelming, if you're not used to it. So I think it's hard for me to understand what it would be like for someone not to sing me happy birthday. I would have had sort of 50 people around for a small family gathering. But I can see with the people I've worked with, yes, they can be very driven by those early life experiences. And as you know, Steve has a social mobility background. His mum had mental health challenges. He had a very different upbringing to me. And so I think when we come to parenting, sometimes it's different. I have two amazing older stepchildren, and our four children are really, really close. But what's been wonderful is see them grow together, and they're so close and making our own family traditions and our own family system. But it's a melting pot of all our life experiences and skills.
It is, and Lee and I each brought two children to the marriage, and so it's been a real joy for me to get to know her son and daughter. A bit older, really. They were probably about 16 when we met, or even maybe younger. And they've gone on to have very happy lives and interesting careers. And for Lee to be an extra mum to my two girls. I think it's very interesting about sort of that old question about if you were to go back to the young Pavita Cooper, age 16 to 18, what advice would you give yourself? But I'd probably ask a different question. Is what advice would you give to aspiring leaders from underrepresented groups who aim to get up and do some of the roles that you did and get onto boards? What would be your advice to the aspiring leaders from the underrepresented groups?
Well, one of the things that we see happen with minority groups, whether that's ethnic minorities or women, is that often people feel a pressure to over assimilate, and it's called code switching. So the person I am at work versus the person I am the rest of the time. And if I'm really honest, I probably spent most of my executive career doing that. So you show up with a version of yourself where you minimize the bits of you that focus on the difference of who you are in order to make other people feel comfortable with you. So you present a version that other people who are in the majority feel comfortable with because you make them feel it's okay for you to be around. And that comes at a huge personal price. It can be quite stressful because you're code switching all the time. However, after my many, many, many years working in businesses and working with leaders and my own experiences, what I've learned is, and certainly since I stopped my executive career, I gave myself permission to be much more just me. And so in this stage of my career, the people get the authentic me, who I am. And I wish I'd learned and understood that earlier. So what I would say to minority colleagues is, despite the pressure to conform, despite the pressure to feel like you have to be like everybody else, despite the pressure to turn up and feel like you just want to fit in because it makes other people feel more comfortable and therefore increase the chance of you being successful. The reality is, I think you've got more chance of being successful if you can just be yourself more. Because it's that difference that really brings out the value of who you are. And if you're wanting to get on a board, that's what a chair is going to want to see and bring. But it is hard because I recognize I did it myself for many years. And often people don't want people who are very, very different. They want more people who are just like them.
Yeah.
But that's my insight. Just be yourself more.
And I hugely relate to what you're talking about in my own different way. I was one of those white boys who, because my father was killed when I was 2.5, mother had 3 boys and she was age 33. She was trying to bring them up on her own. She had very little money. We began living in a caravan and then we got help from various other relations. But I was sent away to boarding school and I can't have been more than about 8. And I learned as I stood there on the pavement and my mother drove away and I was crying, and the housemaster said, "We don't cry here. Stop that sniveling."
What an awful thing to say to a
Yeah,
young.
yeah. And like, okay, so don't feel. So I learned to put a mask on. And I think you call it very powerfully code switching, but I learned there was a certain way that was acceptable and the way that wasn't acceptable. And what you did was you masked, and to fit in and over assimilate, you hid how you felt. And go into the little tuck box room and have a little bit of cake from home, which was about probably by this stage 6 weeks old, and probably I shouldn't have eaten it, but it was a little bit of connection to home, or a letter from your mother. In those days, you'd get a letter, or you have. Don't think you didn't think we were allowed a phone call. It was just a letter once a week. You were
The
also
hug probably in that moment, didn't you?
yeah, you had to sit down and write the letter, and you got the one letter you're allowed. It was brutal. And then, of course, I institutionalized myself more by going into the British Army. And then, officers behave in this way and you don't behave that way. I remember turning up at the army with my Burton's brown suit. I had pinstripes in it. It was brown, dark brown with lighter brown pinstripes. I thought I was the bee's knees. They thought I looked like something from another age because they're, "Oh no, Jonathan, you don't wear that. You
Brown
need
in
you
town.
need to you need to come and see this Savile Row tailor." I couldn't afford a Savile Row tailor. And I remember then going to the Scots Guards, where I was a whole new world of, James the Viscount this and Patrick the Right Honourable that, and the commanding officer saying, well, they may be incompetent officers, but it's really important that we have titles in the regiment. It does help with our status. I thought, goodness me. And so then I put another mask on, and it's only now in my 60s doing these courses that I've removed the masks. And it's such a joy. And it's okay to be without the mask. But for so long, I thought I had to hide behind this mask of being something I wasn't. And I think whether it's because you're from an ethnic group or you're from a gender, um, there's too many people going around who are really not being themselves. They're living somebody else's life. And Isadora Duncan said, it's far better to be a first-class version of yourself than a second-class version of somebody else. And Oscar Wilde, who said, everybody else is taken, just be yourself. But of course, we can say that now, you and I, with the wisdom then. But I couldn't say that to the younger version of myself. It just wasn't safe to be me because I was teased or bullied. And someone else I was going to have on the podcast that, had to go away and help their child who was being bullied at school, and they needed to talk about duty of care at the school and things. So it still goes on. So I feel lucky that you and I can talk about this now, but how do we help the 15-year-old, 16-year-old who doesn't feel they can be themselves, whatever their gender, their sexual orientation, their race, their background, their class, because they will be teased for being the other, being different? It's a big topic, but I don't know. Any thoughts?
One of the things I do is I do speakers for schools. So I go into schools, as do many other thousands of leaders, and talk to young disadvantaged kids. I tend to only focus on very poor areas and with particularly high ethnic minority representation. So you might have 98% of young black kids, young Asian kids in areas of deprivation, or it might be young white kids, but it might be somewhere like Poole or Portsmouth, where areas where there's low employment. And I think the reason that's important is that me physically standing up in front of those young kids saying, this is me today, and my background wasn't that different to yours. My grandmother was in a council flat, and my parents came here with the equivalent of £10 and started with nothing. I think it helps them say it is possible. And that's why visible role models are really, really important, because you can't be what you can't see. And the reason I love Robert Peston's initiative, Speakers for Schools, is because it's wonderful a range of leaders. It's highly accomplished business leaders, but it's people like you and me who are different, who can go in and say, well, if I can do it, so can you. I have a friend who does it, and he presents as posh, middle class white man, but he's severely dyslexic, but he built a business from scratch that generated millions and employed lots of people. And so he can say, look, I was really struggling at school. I couldn't even pass my exams, but look at me now. So I think the difference can show up in many, many ways. But I think young people need that, because otherwise all they're hearing, and I think about my neurodiverse son, is pass exams, do well, go to university. There's this one route to success. Whereas what we can do is say to them, the route to success can be in many, many ways. And I'm here, and it was tough for me at the beginning, but you can do it. And so providing inspiration and aspiration is just as important for young people as access to internships and apprentices and opportunity, because we know talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not.
I think that's a beautiful story, and you can't be what you can't see. The personal example of people and stories from people is so incredibly powerful. And in storytelling, I got trained as a world-class speakers coach. So I coach my CEOs sometimes in their speaking. But often in storytelling, it's then, now, and how. So how you were then, how you are now, but how you got from there to here. And that it's actually really healthy for people to be vulnerable, and not in a sort of sobbing victim kind of way, but just to say, look, here's my CV, the alternate CV of all the mistakes and blunders and jobs I didn't get and firms that turned me down and things I failed at. But I'm here and I'm okay. So I think the alternative CV is always an interesting one. We're now at the time to do your 2-minute top tip. It's amazing. There's so much we could have talked about. So many other questions I've got, but would you just be so good as to introduce yourself, say the kind of work you've done in the past, what you're doing now, and give us your practical 2-minute top tip, Pavita? Over to you.
So I'm Pavita Cooper. I am a board advisor. I work with top teams, chairs and boards around culture and inclusion. I'm also a portfolio non-executive. I sit on a number of boards, and I also work across national security. And I'm also the chair in the UK of the 30% Club, a campaign to improve gender representation across businesses, and a broader campaigner for greater equity, and spend a lot of my time thinking about how can we help the most disadvantaged community to level up and have the same opportunities. I've got 2 top tips, if that's okay, Jonathan. The first is, in my many, many years of experience, I've been working a long time now. I think my own personal experience and what I observe in the organizations I go into is that the one thing leaders can do that makes the biggest difference is close what I call the say-do gap. So the gap between what leaders espouse versus what they actually do. Now, that can be at an organizational level in terms of culture, or it can be about something very specific individually to a top team, to an executive team, or to that specific CEO and leader themselves. And the reason I say that is that when I go in and talk to colleagues and run listening groups, and I say to them, describe to me what it feels like around here, talk about the culture, those are the things that come up quickly and immediately. It's the things colleagues point to that creates the biggest dissonance in their culture. And so I've learned, actually, if a leader can do one thing, it's tune into what is going on that say-do gap for them, for their wider team, for their leadership group. And the second that I would speak to is just in terms of resilience. I mean, I've been working a long time, but I intend to keep going. And so that's not going to be without setbacks or disappointment or without things I perceive as failure. And so you have to be able to really build resilience to say, this was not my kismet. It was not meant to happen now. There is another, the universe is sending me a signal that something else is out there for me. And one of the ways that I think you build resilience is to be able to reset when things haven't gone your way. And the way I do that is I've got this lovely John Lennon saying, this quote that I keep in all my notebooks and I stick it everywhere, which is, everything will be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, it's not the end. And I do lots of talks to younger people in schools, in businesses, and I always share that because I find that increasingly, the kind of millennials and Gen Zs today have this sense that everything's got to be perfect and now, and it's just not going to be that way.
Yeah. What great a pair of tips which were really useful, and I will think about that. The say do gap, and everything but will be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, it's not the end. Pavita Cooper, thank you very much for being on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. And if you're listening around the world and you found Pavita's wisdom and experience useful, please share it with other colleagues of you. Spread the word and reach out to her if you'd like her to bring her wisdom and experience to your organization. Thank you, Pavita.
Thanks, Jonathan.